So I think we're starting with a really interesting enrichment subject. Our speaker is Anika Walke. You may remember she spoke about women partisans 2 years ago? About 2 years ago? About 2 years ago. Anika is an associate professor of history, women, gender, and sexuality studies, and international and area studies. Anika Walke's current research looks at the long aftermath of the Nazi genocide in Belarus. In particular, she is interested in how people remember and live with the effects and repercussions of systematic violence. She has recently taught courses on the Holocaust and the history of the Soviet Union. Her books include Pioneers and Partisans, an oral history of Nazi genocide in Belarusia, which came out in 2015. And you may remember a course that she co-taught with Erin McLaughlin that was both teaching here, followed up by a visit to Eastern Europe. You may remember some of the students presented about their experience, and that's happening again, correct? So it's in the midst. Lots of articles, lots of presentations. Something sort of different today that obviously she'll give you the background of. Something that's pretty current and that does affect us as docents, because people bring these issues up to us. Now maybe we'll have a good grasp of the range of the issue. When are historical analogies useful? Comparing the Holocaust to other things, using it as an analogy. It's my privilege to introduce Anika Walke.
All right, good afternoon. I can say good afternoon, it's afternoon. So thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Dan, for this very nice introduction. It's always nice to be back here. Again, I've already given a talk here and have visited several times with students and colleagues. And we certainly want to establish a much more sustained kind of relationship with the institution here, with the Holocaust Memorial and Learning Center in St. Louis, because especially our students who come from other cities who are not from St. Louis, from the region, don't often know about it. But many of them take my classes and they want to know what's local, what can they do locally to learn more, or maybe even engage kind of on a volunteer basis. So I hope we'll expand that, especially with the expansion soon. But for today, I want to talk about an issue that, as Dan already mentioned, is very much present, is very much on people's minds, the question of historical analogies. And I have to say, when Dan asked me in the summer, I was on vacation, and I kind of just glanced at my emails every once in a while. I said, sure, I can talk about that. And then later realized, oh my goodness, what did I sign up for? I was talking about historical analogies. Of course, a big topic. It's also somewhat abstract. So I'm going to try to be very specific and actually talk very specifically about a debate that certainly captured the attention of many of you, I'm sure, but also of many scholars this summer, which is very much the comparison between concentration camps and immigrant detention centers at the border between the United States and Mexico. So just as a reminder for those of you who have kind of already moved on, who didn't really pay attention or don't follow Twitter, I don't actually do it very much. In mid-June this summer, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez released a tweet after visiting several of these detention centers where she compared them to concentration camps. And she says very specifically, as her tweet says here, this administration, the current presidential administration, has established concentration camps on the southern border of the United States for immigrants where they are being brutalized with dehumanizing conditions and dying. This is not hyperbole, it's the conclusion of the expert analysis, and then linked to an article that very specifically says that, yes, we can say that these are concentration camps. As, again, I'm sure you know, many people did not agree with that. They did not agree with that analogy, with that equalization. mainly arguing that concentration camps are camps where people are killed on a massive scale. I'm going to leave that open for right now because I actually think that's probably at the core of the conversation that we have to think about when we think about what is a concentration camp. Is it really a place where people are systematically killed, or is there maybe something else happening that would encourage people to draw analogies between concentration camps erected by the Nazi regime and other facilities? So in response, again, because many people and institutions, some scholars, were quite upset about this comparison and said this is incorrect, this is inappropriate, these are not concentration camps. And that kind of very quickly spiraled into a larger conversation about analogies. When can we make analogies? When can we compare current political developments, trends, institutions to other instances in the past where similar institutions had existed? And among many different other museums, for instance, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. came out with a statement condemning very quickly, very broadly, any analogies between the Holocaust and other events. And that was in response to, I think, several regional museums, including Los Angeles, New York, Dallas, I believe, came out with a critique of the comparison between U.S. detention centers for immigrants and concentration camps. So being very specific about the analogy that they did not agree with. But this statement here by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum went much further, because it says, we do not, unequivocally reject efforts to create analogies between the Holocaust and other events, whether historical or contemporary. So talk about much broader questions about drawing analogies, not only specifically about concentration camps and detention centers. So in response, several scholars, including myself, came out quite forcefully, although many people say it's actually not very forceful, it's actually kind of very diplomatic, and said, well, actually this is not helpful. To say that you cannot draw any historical analogies between the Holocaust and other historical events is not helpful. It actually undermines our mission as scholars, it undermines our mission as educators, because it really would encapsulate the Holocaust in a place and in a time that is completely closed off against anything else. And then Holocaust education is basically meaningless, because it really would assume that the Holocaust happened once and it will never happen again. Because that's what analogies do. They try to compare, they try to look for similarities, they look for similar trends. So an open letter to the director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, to Sarah Bloomfield, was released on the 1st of July in 2019. It was sent directly to the director, but it was also published simultaneously by the New York Review of Books blog, so it's an online publication. It was published at the same time that it was submitted to the director. At the time, there were about 230 signatories, and within 4 days, 580 scholars signed up. And most of them were deeply engaged in Holocaust education, in genocide studies, or generally engaged in the profession of history, where we argue there is actually a very strong need to draw analogies, to make comparisons. Otherwise, we cannot even justify the discipline of history, right? If we say things that happen in the past happen only in the past, why are they interesting to us then? So again, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum rejected any analogies, not going into too much detail, but the scholars in the open letter says that really what we need as scholars in the humanities and social sciences specifically is analogy, is comparison. That is exactly what allows us to answer questions about the past and the present, and to figure out what to do in the present, right? Because if we don't understand the past, we also cannot really understand the present. And in order to do that, we need comparison and contextualization. And very specifically, the letter argued that the very core of Holocaust education is to alert the public to dangerous developments, and pointing to similarities to the past is a crucial element of that. So the response to that letter from the Holocaust Museum never really happened. There was never really a reaction to that. They did release another statement that does not mention the open letter, that didn't really address the questions that were raised in the open letter. It is widely seen as a little bit of a backpedaling, but it doesn't actually very completely address the question of whether analogies are helpful or not. So I'm not going to talk too much more about this particular debate that happened this summer, but rather think a little bit more about what analogies actually are. Because I think often people think analogies, if you draw an analogy between two things, between A and B, you say that they're the same. That's actually not what analogy means, right? Analogies, and this is a very simple research in an online dictionary. This is kind of the definition of analogy. It means a comparison, right? It means you look at one thing, you look at the other, and you see how are they different, how are they similar. And usually that's done to explain something, to kind of understand one phenomenon, in most cases B, better. So an example here is given as an analogy between the working of nature and those of human society. It's a pretty broad question where you try to figure out, do animals have the same social structures as you would have among human beings? And you probably come to a conclusion, no, they don't, right? But there are certain similarities. Correspondence or partial similarity. Again, comparing doesn't mean they are the same, but maybe some certain elements of a particular, in this case, the example that is given of an illness, are similar. Or the third, and all of these are kind of saying essentially the same, is a comparability to something else in significant respects, right? So to analogize, to compare, doesn't mean you say they are the same, but it allows you to understand both of these phenomena better. So if we're looking at analogies, how they're used, on the other hand, shouldn't be anything new. I think you all know when analogies are used. They're often used to accuse or denounce. For instance, very recently, Russia, by several scholars, mostly public intellectual journalists, has been compared to a fascist state, pointing in particular to Putin's very repressive politics and the policies against internal activists, but also in particular to criticize the annexation of the Donbass, an area of Ukraine that had been annexed by Russia in violation of international law in 2014. So that analogy has been drawn quite frequently. It has been debunked and criticized by many others, but it certainly is used to denounce Putin. It's used to denounce the Russian government as a violator of international law, and worse, because fascism, of course, is associated with immense atrocities, with immense systems of violence and oppression. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez statement, of course, was also a way to denounce a certain policy toward immigrants. Right? It was to say, these are concentration camps, and as U.S. citizens, as U.S. politicians, you should not do this. This is not who we are. This is not what this country is. But here there are concentration camps, so we need to dismantle them. Others use this comparison to warn against something else, to say that yes, they are problematic. Maybe they're not quite concentration camps yet. There are similarities, but there are also differences. But maybe they will turn into concentration camps, right? That there's an expectation, or there's a worry, a concern that something worse is going to happen. So there's two different ways in which analogies are commonly used in political and public discourse. And a third one, which I think is what the scholars in the open letter and many others would always argue, is that analogies are often really helpful to educate, to understand, to explain things. And again, to highlight both similarities and differences. And two examples that I can just bring here. During the war in Bosnia in the late 1990s, the campaigns of ethnic cleansing against either Bosnians or Serbs or Croats in different areas of the former Yugoslavia were often compared to other ethnic cleansing campaigns, both during World War II committed by the Nazi regime, but also in the aftermath. Other people used specifically the notion of Auschwitz never again to criticize the internment camps or prison camps that had been established by the Serbian forces, for instance, in Bosnia. and to say these are like the concentration camps, and the world community has an obligation to stop that practice. A second issue that is often used to, or that often is tried to understand by analogies, is the issue of statelessness. There's about 20 million people currently in the world who are stateless, who have no citizenship, which means they have no government that will speak up for them, that will guarantee basic human rights to them. Which often means that people live in very, very deplorable, poor living conditions. It means that they have no say in the political arena. And of course it also means that they're vulnerable, that they're incredibly vulnerable against other states, against individuals, because literally nobody will speak up for them. And that phenomenon of statelessness is often explained or kind of articulated in reference to Hannah Arendt's analysis of statelessness and interwar Europe. Between World War I and World War II, there were also millions of stateless people in Europe, many of them of a Jewish identity, because they had been essentially expelled or neglected as full citizens in the newly emerging nation states that emerged after World War I. And Hannah Arendt, in her analysis, maybe some of you are familiar with that, talks very specifically about what it means not to be a citizen, not to have citizenship, not to have a legal status anywhere. And she very concretely draws the connection between statelessness that was produced in the 1920s to the plight and the fate of Jewish refugees in the late 1930s, especially after German Jews that had been denaturalized and had lost German citizenship as a result of the Nuremberg citizenship laws, but also many other refugees who then literally had no one to speak up for them, and after two other steps were essentially vulnerable to physical destruction. Right? So she makes this, she develops this analysis of saying taking away people's legal status, taking away people's citizenship is the first step toward physical destruction. The second would be people's loss of a social status. They're excluded from any kind of social networks. They cannot rely on others speaking up for them. And that is when you can literally round them up, put them in extermination camps and kill them, because nobody cares. So again, there's several instances of phenomena that we're looking at currently that are frequently used or where analogies are used to try to better understand them or denounce them or warn against them as deeply problematic practices or policies. But I also want to look back to the Nazi regime itself, where using analogies, where comparisons were actively used by ordinary citizens, by scholars, by intellectuals, to understand what is actually happening, what is going on. First of all, of course, we have to look at how did people outside of Germany, or even within Germany, were trying to understand who is this Adolf Hitler? What is this Nazi regime about? What do we have to expect? How do they function? And one of the very central approaches was to compare him to other historical figures who pursued similar politics, who pursued similar ideologies of exclusion, of marginalization, advocating for violence and using violence to use political conflict. So Gabriel Rosenfeld, in a recent article, kind of traced some of the ways in which people tried to understand who is Adolf Hitler, who is the Nazi regime, and discovered that, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, many writers, journalists, and scholars actually referred to some of these historical figures like Robespierre and Napoleon III, Attila the Hun, or Genghis Khan. They did eventually realize that there's actually something else going on. That the longer the war went on and the more people learned about the Nazi atrocities, especially in the extermination camps, they realized that there's something else going on. This is not the same, right? This is really a different historical development that we're looking at here, to the point that Hitler, not Adolf Hitler, but Hitler, as a historical trope, essentially became the new archetype for evil. That he really stood for himself in some ways, while of course, if you're looking back at earlier analysis, drawing on similar practices of practices of violence, of warfare, and so forth. But there was something else. There was something else happening that couldn't be captured by an analogy. On the other hand, when we look to victims of Nazi persecution, they also try to understand what's going on. And if you look at Jewish writings of the time, diaries, poems, other materials that were written, for instance, in the Warsaw Ghetto, often people try to use historical experiences to try to make sense about what's going on and try to figure out what to do. And especially in Eastern Europe, the recent and long past history of pogroms was often kind of a reference point. On the other hand, of course, the exodus of the Bible, the expulsion of Jewish populations from a variety of regions during the Nazi regime was kind of seen as a reiteration of a historical experience way, way past. Right? Again, it turned out that there's actually something else going on. But at the time, this is what people tried to do to figure out what to do. Right? And the comparison to pogroms, of course, the idea was it will pass. This is the wave of violence. We have to make sure to survive, and then things will get better again. Unfortunately, it got worse. In most cases, it got worse. And certainly that is because nobody could imagine that a state would use industrial means to kill people on a massive scale. Right? So again, there is an analogy that doesn't work, that is of limited use. But some of the experiences of violence certainly could be understood by looking into the past. So that's just as a reminder that analogies are what we use to understand the world around us. Right? Comparing our own experiences, comparing other people's experiences to other instances in the past is something that we do, because that's the only way that we can do that. Right? I mean, otherwise, how would you try to understand current politics or current experiences of violence, for instance? So on the other hand, of course, you're all familiar with that. In the first decades after World War II, there was a very, very significant debate: was the Holocaust unique? Was this a singular historical event that is outside of history, that we cannot explain, that we cannot understand with the tools, the methodologies, the imagination that we have developed as human beings? Is there something that is in excess that we cannot explain? That debate went on for a long time, and for some it hasn't ended yet. The consensus is that the Holocaust is both unique but also comparable to other genocides. Right? So there is certainly a recognition that the Holocaust was unique in the way that a state mobilized an ideology, a state apparatus of a bureaucracy, and the technological means that resulted from industrialization to kill people on a massive scale. So in that sense, the Holocaust is certainly unique. It is not unique in other ways. If you take a broader perspective on the Holocaust and look, for instance, at the policies of expulsion in the 1930s. If you look at the policies of expropriation, of taking away Jewish property or other people's property, it is not unique in the fact that millions of people were killed. It's the way that they were killed that is unique, right? But so there's a larger question, I think, that we have to think about when we think about using analogies to try to understand our current situation, but also as Holocaust educators. There's a lot of different dimensions to that, I think, that we need to take into account. But on the other hand, of course, we also understand the Holocaust itself better by looking into other examples of history, like by looking to other genocides. In particular, we can look to the Armenian genocide that happened before the Holocaust, and that was actually used by the Nazi regime to justify, in some ways, the Nazi genocide. We can look at other instances of mass refuge in the 1930s, or look at the refugee crisis of the late 1930s in comparison to others to see what is going on, and that's certainly an analogy that is drawn quite frequently now, especially by criticizing the United States, but also other countries for not admitting refugees, for not admitting people who are in search of asylum. But we can also look to other instances of war that enabled or covered up a genocide. Right? So it goes both ways, in other words. Right? We try to understand the Holocaust better by looking to other historical examples, but we can also use the Holocaust to try to understand better what is happening now, or what has happened in the 1990s, what has happened in other areas. And last but not least, I of course want to point out that the Holocaust education that we all engaged in actually relies on analogies. Because for most of us, I think Holocaust education kind of functions under the sign of never again, right? We're trying to prevent another mass murder with industrial means, but of course even that slogan already implies that there is a comparison. It already implies that we refer to the past, because otherwise we couldn't use that slogan, but it also implies that it could happen again, right? Otherwise we don't need to do Holocaust education. Because there's a recognition that some of the trends and developments that facilitated and enabled the Nazi genocide, meaning the occurrence of anti-Semitism, of racism, of eugenics, of Nazism, that they are not gone, that they continue to exist in people's minds, that these are ideas that are circulating, and certainly that modern societies also have the means to pursue a similar assault on ethnic minorities, on select groups of people. So in essence, Holocaust education actually relies on comparison. It relies on an approach that compares both the past and the present, or even the future. So let's return to the issue of concentration camps and detention centers just for a few more minutes before I hope we can have a little discussion. So these are images that most of you probably have seen in some way, shape, or form. One on the left side, Tornillo, Texas, primarily used for children who have been separated from their families. This is an inside view of cages in the McAllen Detention Center in Texas. And some of these images certainly are the cause for many people to say these are concentration camps, right? There's the architecture of the camp, of mass accommodation for people with no privacy, or in this case here, actually overcrowded. There's literally not enough place to sit or sleep. And that encourages people to think about these as concentration camps. And I want to return to kind of thinking a little bit more about what concentration camps are. Because you are all aware of what they are, right? You give tours, you have studied Holocaust history, you probably have a pretty good grasp of concentration camps during the Nazi regime. The Nazis were not the first to use that kind of technology of rounding up and interning people. So when we look at concentration camps, we're looking actually at a pretty long history of imprisonment and detention that did not start in 1933 with the first concentration camp in Dachau outside of Munich. But we're looking at a technology of imprisonment that was definitely used in the late 19th century by the Spanish colonial regime in Cuba. It was used by US troops in the Philippines. It was used by British troops in South Africa during the war wars around the turn of the century. It was also used in what is currently Namibia by German colonial powers to round up children, women, men, and elderly who were perceived to potentially rise up against the German colonial regime and who lived very, very similar to Cubans or Philippines who were interned in massive campsites, who were interned in very, very difficult conditions. Who didn't have access to food, didn't have access to medical care, sanitary conditions were very, very poor. So many people died in this camp, in these camps, but many also were directly killed by German colonial forces. And so some scholars actually argue that these are the precursors of the Nazi concentration camps. Because these were camps where not only civilians were held simply because of their ethnic identity, but also where mass death was expected and where it was also actively produced by literally shooting people. So again, this is kind of a longer history of concentration camps that some people evoke when they compare immigrant detention centers to concentration camps. Because they argue that there is a longer history, and on the other hand, there is also a variety of camps that the Nazis established. right? There were concentration camps like the one in Dachau, where political activists, were members of the opposition, were so-called asocials, where homosexuals were held as a form of punishment, where concentration camps essentially replaced prisons because there was not enough space, where they were forced to work, and where they were held often indefinite, often without a trial. There were also labor camps, there were also labor education camps, and there were extermination camps, right? And extermination camps are the camps that were specifically designed to organize mass murder. So some of the comparisons, or some of the critique toward the comparison of concentration camps with US detention centers, I think actually specifically talk about extermination camps. Because they argue that the concentration camps is a site where thousands of people were killed in gas chambers. Right? Not all concentration camps, not all labor camps were mass murder sites. I don't question that people did not die in these camps, but they were not designed as killing facilities. So we have to be really careful to kind of specify which camps are we talking about when we use those comparisons. On the other hand, of course, there is an association that we have. There are associations that people have with concentration camps that are very, very deeply grounded in the image of Nazi extermination camps. For many people, that's the only kind of camp they know, right? That's the only kind of camp they've heard of, is Auschwitz-Birkenau, maybe Treblinka, but these are the killing camps. They don't actually know about other concentration camps that existed in the Nazi regime and that targeted people that were not Jewish, people that were not doomed to extermination. So there is, of course, a challenge to kind of be, on one hand, specific as a scholar or as a well-informed citizen who knows very well that history, and then on the other hand, as the popular understanding of that history. Right? And they often collide. They often collide, and this is where I think a lot of the reaction to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez critique came from. That there is a little bit of a disconnect between a very scholarly and deep, concrete analysis of the Nazi regime and kind of the public understanding, or widely shared public understanding. But I also want to point to internment camps, which are often understood to be a certain kind of concentration camp. Because like others, there are camps in which large groups of civilians are held without trial, or often without having violated any law. This is kind of the consensus of what concentration camps are. That these are facilities in which large groups of civilians, so not prisoners of war, are held without a trial, where they're often placed in there literally because of who they are and what they might be doing, but not of what they have done, but more in kind of a suspicion that because of their identity, they're somehow dangerous. So internment camps function in this same logic, essentially. And just as a reminder, I think we all know about the internment of Japanese citizens during World War II in the United States, but I also want to remind us of Canadian internment camps for Ukrainians during World War II, where Ukrainians were, during World War I, excuse me, where Ukrainians were seen as an enemy because Canada was involved in World War I. So Ukrainians living in Canada were interned in camps as potential enemies, as kind of internal enemies, if you will, who lived on Canadian soil. And then last but not least, in France, the internment camp in Gurs and others, where often Germans were held during World War II, before France was actually occupied by Germany, because the assumption was that they would undermine the French defense mechanism. One of the most prominent prisoners certainly is Hannah Arendt, who was interned as a German, as an enemy alien in this internment camp. Even though she was a Jew, she had fled Germany, had lost her citizenship with the Nuremberg laws, was denaturalized, but then was seen as a German, was seen as an enemy alien. So many thousand German Jews who had fled Nazi Germany actually were trapped in these internment camps, and many of them were later arrested by the Nazi regime, by German troops, once they had entered and occupied France. Hannah Arendt luckily made it out, but many others didn't, right? So there are internment camps where, from all we know, people are not forced to work, or they're not systematically killed. but where they are held because of their identity and because of an assumption that they might be doing something, right? And this is, of course, something that puts them in pretty close to immigrant detention centers, where, as of now, as far as we know, people are not forced to work. There are no systematic killings, even though we know of several deaths in ICE detention. But we do know that in these internment centers, asylum seekers are kept from particular countries, right? So there is a notion of an ethnic profiling that puts people in a position to be placed in these immigrant detention centers at the border between U.S. and Mexico currently. So in that sense, they function like the internment camps, right? But as several scholars, including Tim Snyder, have pointed out, people who are in these detention centers currently do not have access to due process. Many of them have no access to legal representation, have never spoken to a lawyer, don't actually understand the legal framework that they're dealing with, and have really no recourse, have no access to rights that they have as asylum seekers. Right? To ask for asylum is actually an internationally codified human right. So they have not violated any law by trying to claim asylum. We also know about deeply inadequate conditions and supplies, denial of medical care. That is, again, makes many, many people sick. And again, we've also heard of several deaths in these centers, including several children. So when scholars and others have pointed out or making this argument they are like concentration camps, they do that often by pointing to the dangers that these immigrant detention centers pose. And the first one is, of course, that these are camps that are basically closed off to the public. Even representatives often have no access to visiting these sites or have to ask for permission many days in advance. But they also are sites where abuse happens all the time, and there's no protection for these people. There's no protection for immigrants because they have no access to legal representation. But the government, of course, also does not protect them, which is technically the government's job, is actually to take care of asylum seekers. So people are incredibly vulnerable to abuse because nobody would see it, nobody will report it, or nobody will take the report. Right? There's no mechanism that ensures people are not violated physically or psychologically. We have a whole subset a set of strategies of control: humiliation, dehumanization. People are put in cages. Often people report that they're not called by name, which is pointed at. They're humiliated by not having access to proper sanitary facilities, by being able to wash their clothes or wash themselves, and so forth. And some scholars have noted that in American prisons, prisoners often are forced to work. And so the question is, will immigrants who are contained in these detention centers, will they become part of that prison labor system, potentially? We don't know yet, there is no evidence for that, but it is certainly a specter that people have raised. And I want to conclude with just an example where some of the more drastic predictions or the dangers that scholars have raised is actually happening. And this forces us to look to Australia, the so-called offshore detention centers. Maybe some of you have heard that Australia several years ago decided not to admit any refugee who arrives by boat, who arrives via sea. Instead, they created detention centers on islands around Australia. And here's one writer who, by the name of Bukani, and this is an article from yesterday. I could have found others, but this is an article from yesterday, who wrote a book and received many, many awards, actually in Australia for this book, but he cannot claim it because he is interned in one of these detention centers. But he describes the process of admission, where he literally says that the asylum seekers are issued oversized t-shirts, so they all look the same, and an identification number, which means they lose their name. And they're then called on by number. And so this is one example in which immigrant detention is kind of always on the verge of opening up other possibilities of abuse, of dehumanization and violence. And that is certainly the specter of violence and abuse that many who will use concentration camps to criticize US detention centers refer to. So these are just a few notes that I collected over the last few months to try to understand myself better. When do we use analogies? When are they appropriate? When are they useful? Or when should we not draw them? As you probably gathered, I don't not have a concluding answer. I do think that analogies can be really helpful to understand our present world and our position within this world. But we also have to recognize where they have limitations, where they're not enough, or where they maybe are inappropriate. But I do think that using history, using past experiences to make sense of our present world is crucial. There's actually no other way to do that. So I assume that opens a lot of questions. That's the first one, but I think we have some time.
I just have a question. We were talking about detention centers and all of that, and there's a big elephant in the room, though. We're talking about fascism and all that. We haven't talked anything about Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Ukrainian famine, Cambodia, the Long March. He's killed hundreds of millions of people, and we're comparing Hitler to Trump's detention centers. I have a problem with that. I mean, that's just my personal opinion.
I don't disagree with that. What I was trying to do is to trace the current debate, which is very much focusing on Nazi concentration camps and not on Soviet Gulag camps. But I can actually go back to one of the slides earlier where I pointed out to the ways in which Holocaust education itself has often used criticism of concentration camps during the Nazi regime to criticize other instances of violence. So very concretely, I'm thinking here about the International Commission Against the Concentration Camp Regime in 1949 that was founded by survivors of Nazi concentration camps, and they specifically used their experiences and their analysis of concentration camps to point out similarities to camp imprisonment in the Soviet Union, in Franco, Spain, in Algeria committed by the French colonial troops, but also in China. So this certainly is a conversation that I think should include much more than the Nazi regime. I focused on that because of where we are, but also because this is kind of the public debate currently.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, what I am experiencing, what I think you have done very skillfully, I might add, is to prove that Holocaust concentration camps are not so different in many ways as those of us who know about them believe, because you've skillfully sort of chipped away at the issue of uniqueness by each example that you used, so that your conclusion, or part of your conclusion, what is the conclusion with the last slide, indicated that there in some ways is a connection between Japanese detention camps and what you've been talking about before, but you did it step by step by step by step. And I'm thinking of a classroom of college students who don't know a lot of history and who only know about the Japanese detention camps perhaps from what you've talked about. And when you compare that to any of the Buchenwalds and other concentration camps, it's absurd, but there it is on the screen. And so personally, I object to the fact that, not that analogies are wrong or can't be useful, but that over a period of time, they can be used to chip away at the issue of uniqueness of the Holocaust. And that bothers me.
We have a lot of hands.
Okay. I think one of the fascinating exhibits in our museum that I try to point out when I give a tour shows the history of some of the abusive and restrictive initiatives of the Nazis against the Jews. You know, for example, I'll ask people, when was the first ghetto established? And they'll say, well, it was 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, when in fact the first ghetto was established in the year 1516 in Venice. Similarly with badges and burning of books. So Hitler built on the history of abuses. He didn't invent these things.
Do you think it matters how people get to these camps? I mean, in one historical situation, they're rounded up and put there by the government or wherever else it's doing for. And the other, they just come and they have to be put someplace. In this case, in the southern border, people are coming across the border, legally and illegally, in volume that can't be handled by the facilities that were presently available. It seems to me, we have pictures of displaced persons camps in our exhibits. And that if you're going to make the comparison at all, it's much more like a displaced persons camp, which were not great places to be in those times. No privacy, inadequate medical care, and these were the good guys providing, the soldiers who freed them. They didn't have any of these things, no toothbrush. And so that's why I sort of object to calling it concentration camps. I think that the way people arrive there is very different, and the motive for trying to do things to them is 180 degrees separate. We're trying to help people, give them medical care, do the best we can. They round it up in order to do bad things.
Yes and no. I think agree that there's a difference in the way in which people arrive in these camps and then are placed in these camps. What I do find worrisome is that the conditions in the detention centers at the U.S.-Mexican border are worse than they would have to be. I think if you would want to talk about them as facilities that support refugees, that make it possible for them to live in a decent life and to escape violence, that is clearly not happening. And I would still hold the United States of America as a pretty rich country, and I think the resources are available. So I think there's a difference in the way in which people end up in these sites, but the treatment of them within it is deeply problematic, and I think should worry us. Especially some of the reports that we get in terms of the violence that immigrants report that are held in these facilities, beyond not having the basic supplies. But people are reporting about beatings. We know about several people who have died as a result of the active denial of medical care. And we also know about conversations within the U.S. Border Patrol that specifically refers to Nazi-era terminology to talk about these immigrants as parasites that need to be gassed, that need to be placed in gas chambers, and that need to be gotten rid of. So that these are some of the elements of the current practice of immigrant detention that I find very, very worrisome. Other than that, I completely agree with you that this is not a forceful military roundup of people that are then placed behind barbed wire. At the same time, according to international law, the U.S. government actually has an obligation to supply asylum seekers with basic necessities, and I think it would be possible. Right? So there is, it's a gray zone. It's a difficult situation for sure. Yeah.
With black students, when we do our work, often they will ask about comparing, they don't mostly know the word analogy, the Holocaust to slavery in this country. And there are some comparisons, but as you've talked about, there are many, many differences. And I think when we get asked about that, it's terribly important that we acknowledge some of the similarities, but also some of the differences.
Yeah, of course. All the way in the back.
I think there is something that happens before the comparison or the analogy. And I would say when Cortez did it, it was political entrapment. There's so much going on about Jews and Israel and anti-Semitism now. And whereas another time it may not have exploded so much, it did. And what it did is it entrapped anti-Semitism and spewed it out more. So when is it not insulting to compare? Or when, I feel really strongly that there is not a comparison to the Holocaust. But there are times people say it, it doesn't bother me, but there's times when they do it with entrapment behind. I don't know if
I'm
I'm
sure I
clear.
understand what you mean by the anti-Semitism and entrapment.
Well, say the word Israel, and people think that American Jews are Israeli and are doing something bad to people on the West Bank. There is anti-Semitism entrapped in some of these things, or other, you know, we're in a Jewish environment right here, so I'm using anti-Semitism. But it can be pre-planned or just a way of accepting, this is, you know, knowing that it's going to cause a big commotion.
There's a lot going on. So I think I'm going to try to answer to two dimensions of this comment. One of them is that, of course, the Holocaust has become the symbol of evil. It has become the symbol of absolute evil that we will try to do our best to never again happen. But we also use it to denounce certain practices that remind us of certain experiences of the Holocaust. And so in many ways, the Holocaust is also used to provoke, right? And it certainly is a provocation to say these are concentration camps, because she's a smart woman. She knows that for most people, Nazi concentration camps equals Auschwitz, or Auschwitz equals Nazi concentration camps.
Who
The other way, right? So that...
How does she know that? How do you know she knows that? I don't know what she knows.
I don't know what she knows either. But if I ask my incoming college students what they know about the Holocaust, they know about Auschwitz. They don't know about Treblinka. They don't know about the mass shootings in the Lithuanian forest. I think there's a certain metaphor for the Holocaust, which is Auschwitz, and which is an extermination camp. And this is what most people think about when they think about concentration camps. So to say that US detention centers are concentration camps, of course, plays with that. Right? It wants people to get enraged and to say, no, this is not what they are, and this is not what we want here. There certainly is a provocation. But as I hope my talk has shown, that there is also a little bit of truth in it to say concentration camps or detention centers can look like concentration camps in certain aspects, the way they're organized, why people are placed in there. And there are similarities that we have to be aware of in order to make sure nothing worse is going to happen. But the anti-Semitism question, I don't really know how to respond to that.
She could have mentioned a different type of, how about, we're Americans, how about Japanese internment?
Yeah, but she used the word concentration camps. She actually didn't talk about the Holocaust.
Well, but we know that concentration camps could have been work camps, could have been whatever. She may, I don't know what she thinks about death camps, but anyway.
Yeah, again, I don't know what she thinks, but I don't think using concentration camp as a comparison is inherently anti-Semitic. I don't think that's what it is.
Sure it is.
There was a different twist on this in a review of a book by Deborah Lipstadt in Sunday's New York Times, comparing how Germans remember the Holocaust to how Americans remember slavery. And the reason it's kind of relevant, and Margaret was referring to this, and her comment, because a lot of us are former teachers, American teachers, it comes up, you know, more logically in an American context. And where it was alarming to me related to your wonderful presentation, very helpful, was the implication was that Germans know a lot more about the Holocaust than Americans know about slavery. Well, if that's true, you know, we're not equipped, you know, to do these analogies. If we, you know, we have to know something about these things, and you know, puts teachers in a real. Well, we have a number of people. I know who are retired. I think most everybody's retired. Joe, are you retired now? I didn't yet. Okay. Anyway, it was just a little different twist on it. I guess maybe it's more in the memory studies. That I don't know where that all fits. You know, memory and history and all the rest of it. But it's fascinating. And if we have so little knowledge of slavery, if this book is right, I don't know if it is or not, then it's kind of a hard thing for teachers to deal with when it comes up.
If there's not a knowledge base.
Julie over here, she's had her hand up.
Yes.
Hi, yeah, I want to thank you very much for your very thoughtful presentation. I really appreciated it. And I also, I think that the reason that the response has been so reactive and so negative to a large extent to AOC's tweet was because of the format, because it was a tweet. Now, this is a discussion that has many levels and has lots of different aspects and lots of different concerns, and it's something that shouldn't be relegated to a tweet. And the other thing is, you know, when she said what she said, she didn't say these detention centers are reminiscent of concentration camps or have features of concentration camps, which is true. She said they are concentration camps, which I respect her, and I think she is very intelligent, but I think that was phrased in the way that it was phrased to get a response and to be provocative, you know what I'm saying? But I really feel like I am leaving here today with more information about it than I had before, you know, and I really appreciate that, and I can see where this is aspects and features of these detention centers are dangerous, and it's hard for us to look at that. I mean, you can see the resistance in the room. It's hard for us to look at what's being done in our name, especially as docents here. That's a painful sort of truth. So thank you for that.
Yeah. No, I can definitely relate to that. I'm glad that you found this presentation useful. And you're certainly right that the format of the tweet is not necessarily conducive to a sincere engagement with particular questions, right? It is, on the other hand, it is how people communicate these days and how they get information out. And yes, she could have said they are like concentration camps, they look like concentration camps. But again, some scholars would actually say, well, this is a concentration camp, right? There's no concluding answer. There's definitely debate about it, and even among the people who signed the letter to the Holocaust Museum, we don't all agree. There are people who very strongly argue that these are not concentration camps. There are others who say, well, they actually are, right? So what we really were trying to do is to argue for being able to draw analogies, for encouraging people to look to the past, to make sense of the present. But it is certainly an issue that there is no consensus among scholars. There's a certain kind of consensus about what a concentration camp is. But as some of the comments already have shown, there's also some very competing understandings of what these detention centers look like and what they are and how they are organized. Right? So in part, we don't actually know very much about them. Like, we know a little bit here and there, but we don't actually know very much about the conditions in these camps. And this is very similar to what happened in the 1930s and 1940s, but it's also very similar to earlier concentration camps that have existed. So there's certainly also a lot of work we still need to do to understand the situation better.
I don't see how you can compare concentration camps to internment camps. Concentration camps were people were taken out of their homes, citizens of the country, and put in a concentration camp. In the internment centers, we have people coming to this country, being illegal, and they're coming in mass quantities, and there's not enough facilities to handle them. And that leads to some poor treatment. But you can't compare the two.
Again, what I was trying to show you is that concentration camps were not invented by the Nazis. There are a whole variety of concentration camps. So I think we have to kind of look at some of these details when we try to draw these comparisons, right? And it's kind of
I didn't stand to indicate to end. I just kind of wanted to keep an eye on hands, and I saw Megan and Joe and Alan.
I think, Earl brought up the issue of, drawing analogies takes away from the uniqueness of the Holocaust. I don't think it does because, there have been genocides, but what makes the Holocaust unique is the efficiency and the scale. State mandated. Those things are the uniqueness. And so learning about the Holocaust, when we see the Russian Gulag, Holocaust, when we see the Japanese internment camps, when we see Rwanda, knowing about the Holocaust, that should just set off alarm bells. Not that it's the same thing, but it's like, uh-oh, this, we know what this can lead to. And that's, I think, what it is trying to tell us. Yes.
Analogies are about similarities and differences. So the differences matter, and so do the similarities.
But also, they're partly similar. Like there are parts that are similar. Right. So if we would say U.S. immigration policy is the Holocaust, that would certainly be really accurate. Right. But if we're looking at particular facilities and institutions that are used, and if we're looking at particular facilities and institutions that were used by the Nazi regime, they can be similar, but they're in a different context. So I don't know who's on the list.
Joe?
Yeah. First of all, I really like the slide we're looking at right now because I did retire recently from a 40-year career of teaching history. And I learned as I grew older, a little wiser, that it's troublesome when you put things into binary terms. Yes or no, black or white. When you're saying, can an analogy be made here or can it not be made? Analogies have to be made. If we want to avoid repeating some of the terrible things from the past and use education as a tool to make that happen, use history as a tool to make that happen, analogies have to be made. But I don't know if it always has to be, a debate about whether or not you can draw an analogy between what's going on in the detention centers today in Texas versus concentration camps in the past, and say yes or no, and you're limited to those two choices. What I learned in the last several years of teaching was to always offer students a spectrum. Where you can say this is one extreme of Auschwitz, and maybe something else can be placed at the other extreme. And then where do we take all these other examples, including what's going on right now in the detention centers, and where should that be placed? That way you don't have necessarily to say it's yes or no.
I'm hearing the solution, a change of this heading from Holocaust education relies on analogies to Holocaust education uses analogies.
I don't think that's different.
As a fellow educator, thank you for your presentation. And you also have a unique 10,000-foot perspective that many of us here lack. What would you use, what would you suggest would be appropriate analogies for us to use and try to convey our message?
Which message?
The Holocaust, from your displays, it says it reaches it. You were trying to present the Holocaust as use the Holocaust as an educational tool to prevent certain future behaviors. We don't want to teach the Holocaust as an abstract event in history. We want to use it as something to motivate people, to educate people in the future, to avoid horrible things that may happen to each other. What would you use? What would be appropriate analogies in your mind to help us convey this message?
That is a hard question.
We'll talk about it in docent training.
I mean, I can tell you how I teach the history of the Holocaust. Of course, with the hope that the students will finish the semester with knowing about how it worked and how to prevent it in the future, how to prevent something similar in the future. And I don't start with 1933. I actually go way back when into European history and the rise of the nation state and an understanding of how people are constituted, how state people are constituted as racial communities. And that is, of course, a much more focus on ideas that develop over time than particular policies or practices, right? Because I actually think that the Nazi regime, the Nazi genocide, relied on a very, very well-established ideological framework over time, where first of all, you understand humanity as consisting of different races, where you have different groups that look differently, but where their physical appearance is not only different, but where their physical appearance also tells us something about their abilities and about their mind and their intellect. and that you then place into a hierarchy. And that is, to me, is at the core of a genocidal project where you divide people, where you divide a group of people into different races, and where some are seen as more valuable than others. So I would think Holocaust education really needs to talk about racism. It needs to talk about anti-Semitism. It also needs to talk about sexism. The Nazi regime was a deeply patriarchal regime and a deeply patriarchal project where women were assigned particular roles, where men were assigned particular roles that they could not leave, that they were not allowed to challenge. So I would always focus on ideas that circulated and that made it possible for a whole society to get together and commit mass murder. Because they understood some people in their midst were not the same, they were different, and they were of lesser value.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's helpful, but I think
Thank you.
rather than looking for concrete examples right now, that would be my suggestion.
Last question. Well, again, thank you for the presentation today. It was very good. And I just want to remind everybody that, part of what we use to teach is change begins with me. And we're trying to relate to our audiences that whether it's anti-bullying or separation or whatever gradations of discrimination we might experience or see are things that we can today address and should be addressing, whether it's bullying or some of the other examples you've got up there. I think those comparisons or analogies do exist, and that's part of why we do these tours.
So thank you so much.